felt like it continued to get worse after inauguration, and he paid the political price for it, even though they weren't necessarily his policies. And then what did he do? He fought very hard to pass the stimulus, never popular, always unpopular. And the other thing he fought very hard to pass was health care, never popular, not in any poll, always unpopular. And those were his two biggest accomplishments. Those were the wrong two things to have accomplished if you were hoping for your popularity numbers to stabilize or go up. And then it was the communication about what he had passed and what he had accomplished didn't work out so well. Obama came in as the greatest communicator since Ronald Reagan, or at least perceived as such. And today, the defeated Ohio Democratic Governor Ted Strickland was very critical of the president for failing to communicate on any number of levels. If the stimulus was so important and saved the economy from falling off the cliff, this president didn't convince many or any Americans that it succeeded. If the Health Care Act was important, was going to ultimately decrease the deficit, provide health care, and do all of these wonderful things without expanding the role of government, et cetera, he didn't convince many or any people of that. So when you put an unpopular policy that he failed to communicate in any significant way on, and an economy that really didn't recover for much of the first 18 months of his presidency, it does make some sense. There's certainly things that they could have done, and they acknowledge it. But boy, going back to your very first question about whether we thought the Republicans would take over the House, I also would be curious to see the folks around this table if they would have believed that Barack Obama's poll numbers would have gone from where they were on January 21st, 2009 to where they are here at the end of 2010.
It's a little bit difficult after hearing these terrific analysis to come up with something new, but we did a lot of focus group testing for the Republican National Committee in the 9 states that turned from red to blue in February 2009. And the key things that we heard was, one, we need to give this president time, which is not a message that our Republican leaders wanted to hear. And so we had to sort of kind of pull on the reins a little bit. They said, he has a lot on his plate. There are a lot of problems with this country. We need to, it's only fair to give him some time. But then within about 90 days, I would say, after the stimulus package passed, it very quickly changed to he doesn't understand his priorities. He has a lack of priorities. He's lost the focus on jobs. And I think two things happened. One, he too quickly worked to expand the government. Two, that was very much evidenced or demonstrated by the stimulus package. And the biggest problem with the stimulus package, besides the fact that it was ineffective in terms of meeting their target, stated target in terms of reducing jobs, is the process by which they tried to implement that totally lacked any transparency. And that's what really rankled independents and grassroots voters across the country. And what changed, in my mind, in terms of saying that the Republicans could gain control was the GOP House conference at the Homestead at the end of January, when Newt Gingrich spoke at dinner that night, and it was the day after every single Republican voted against the stimulus package. So there was total Republican unity. Mike Castle, Mark Kirk, Judy Biggert, Republicans and conservatives marked in lockstep to defeat the stimulus package. And at that point, Newt was the dinner speaker that night, and he said, you know what? We can become the majority in the House of Representatives, and John Boehner will be your next speaker. You need to continue to do what you're doing and show a plan. And for all those critics who said the Republicans lacked a plan, that was very much not the case. I mean, Boehner and the Republican leadership did have a plan, but I think more importantly, recruitment was unbelievable. I mean, there were candidates across the country, and yes, Washington had something to do with recruitment, but more than anything else, President Obama and the policies of the Democrats and their heavy-handed tactics in terms of how they worked to pass legislation really resulted in people across the country saying, I want to run, we need to change the direction of the country, and the time is now. And I think that helped to spur this incredible change that we saw with independent voters.
First, Bill, I just want to tell you how much fun I'm having so far.
Gets even better, Jim.
Yeah. And second, I'd like to say, how come I wasn't invited 2 years ago when we all looked like geniuses having just won the campaign? You bring me back after the biggest series of setbacks for for Democrats in, I don't know, since 1938 or something. You numbers guys can tell me. But actually, it is fun to be here. And let me give you a couple of thoughts. I agree with a lot of what's been said so far going around the table. I do want to bring it back to sort of the human dimension, though, because that's what I was dealing with every day. I was out doing a number of the Senate races this time. People are hurting, and you know it here in Kansas, and you know it in the states I was working in, like Senator Reed's race in Nevada and California, all across this country. And, you know, if you are in a circumstance where you have 15% unemployment, which is what we were facing in, say, the Nevada race, where 2/3 of the houses were upside down, where people owed more on their mortgages than the house was worth, when they looked out at the cul-de-sac that they lived on and saw the house across the way, that now they could purchase for $200,000 when they spent $400,000 and are still making that payment. To those people, I understand why they're angry. I understand why they want change. I understand why they are looking for something different, even if they supported our president this last time or Democrats in the past for Senate or governor. And that was true all across this country. And, you know, it's interesting, as I sat in those focus groups that a lot of the other people were, you'd sit on the other side of that, you know, glass one-way mirror, and you'd listen, and on the one hand, there'd be this intellectual conversation that would take place, and somebody would say, gee, you know, I know it's going to take 2-3 years before we really turn this economy around. And you'd go, oh, you know, maybe this isn't going to be so bad. And then 2.5 minutes later, they would say, God damn it, somebody better change it right now. And you would get both of those things from the same person within the span of 90 seconds. And I understand it, and I felt it, and I think we felt it as Democrats all across this country, of people who really weren't going to give, you know, politicians a whole lot of time to try to figure out they needed help now, and I get it, and I understand it, and I respect it, but I do think that had a big, big impact, and we can talk about a lot of other things, but to me, every day, as I'm out there trying to figure out what ads to put up in these races and how am I going to deal with it, this ability to not connect, or inability to connect, to give people the confidence that we were really making some progress. And I guess I would sort of in that same regard say, you know, people know what is happening to them, not what didn't happen to them. So we can go out there and say the stimulus, right, would have cost, if we had not done it, another 3 million or 4 million additional jobs. And that we could debate, but I think that there are an awful lot of economists who would have said there were millions of jobs at stake. That doesn't do you much good if you're the one about to lose the house and you're still looking for a way out. And that's one of the things. Okay, I'll be quicker on my other 2 points. Second, I think that there was a real miscalculation in terms of what I had hoped would be at least a period of Republicans and Democrats working together. And call me old-fashioned. We were just talking about this, actually, David and I were beforehand, but that the tone in Washington and the inability, even on something like, you know, these big economic issues that were huge, or maybe healthcare, where I actually thought there was the opportunity perhaps to do something fairly significant at the beginning, but it immediately locked down, and then getting into a really desperate political back and forth with the Republicans, I think coming out of really that session probably, deciding we're going to just not really be there and cooperate, trying to be very careful here in my, you know, in the words, that set up what was a very, very bad conversation that continued out through the rest of the campaign. So, you know, failure to articulate the course the way it should have been articulated, the vision, what many of you have said, I agree with. Needed to do a better job. The decisions about what to go forward with first certainly may have had big implications, but that overall economic context and the inability to get people working together, I think, were some of the key things that created the problem.
Follow up on what Linda was saying about Republican support for Obama, because I think when you talk about that 64% approval rating number, that had a lot to do with, kind of substantial, not overwhelming, or certainly even majority support from Republicans. But Obama had about a third, of Republicans approving of the job he was doing early on in his presidency. By this fall, we registered him at 8% among Republicans. 8%. That was far lower than Bill Clinton had ever been among Republicans. Now, that's some part Obama and some of the policy things that have been discussed around the table in the Obama administration, and we can talk about those. But it's also about the political climate we live in. George W. Bush had been in the single digits among Democrats for much of the last 3 years of his presidency. But never before that period had any president been in single digits in Washington Post, ABC News polling since we started polling in late in the Carter administration. And it mainly holds up in Gallup data going back to the 30s, but I haven't checked that in detail, but I will, having brought this up now. But I mean, it's a remarkable turn, and the inability to get support from one of the two major political parties really puts a cap on a presidential approval number. And so, that needs to be part of the context we think about. But also, I mean, just going back to issue number one, the economy, the last time the country was in the throes of such a major recession was in the early 80s. And you take Obama's approval ratings from the very beginning to now, they track almost exactly with Reagan's. And, we say it again and again in our polling analyses that we put out once a month, and hopefully you will now read. But, they track almost exactly. They correlate, almost perfectly with what happened to Reagan in the first 2 years of his presidency. And the overwhelming factor then, as now, was the economy. So, we can debate lots of other things, but that is really the driver here.
Okay, we're not here, I think everybody knows, to debate policy outcomes or things like that, but just to really try to understand. With that in mind, let me kind of ask a follow-on question. Now I'm just going to open it up to everybody, and please, all of you respond, though. The president's problems stem more from the substance of what he's done, okay, bad politics, let's say, not bad policy, or more from the administration's failure to communicate what they were trying to achieve with these policies? Don't everybody speak at once.
I'll start, because I think that I think it's a scapegoat to say that it was just a bad communication strategy. The president communicated constantly. He's out there all the time. I thought, and I know that his team of communicators and I respect a great deal, have a different perception of the media today and how you communicate, and I think that they believe that you don't just have a message today, and you don't worry about stepping on your message. You can put out 3 different messages because there's so much media out there that you've got different audiences. And I think that's great in theory. I don't actually think it tracks with reality, but they did communicate a lot.